Welcome to the SVA Theater. My name is Isabel Tauby, and I teach art history and aesthetic theory at SVA in the BFA Visual and Critical Studies program and also art history in the honors program. Tom Hoon, the chair of the BFA Visual and Critical Studies department, who, as many of you know, is in Rome this semester, lucky Tom, asked me to serve as organizer and host for the spring 2014 Art in the First Person series of presentations that are hosted by the BFA Visual and Critical Studies department. In addition to tonight's presentation, we have two presentations coming up in April. Tatiana Flores, who's associate professor at Rutgers University, associate professor of art history, will give a talk on theorizing Latin American avant-gardism on April 8th. And the photographer Leslie Hewitt will present her work on April 22nd. Both of those events will happen in the room that we often are in as opposed to the large Silas Theater, which is 101 in the West 23rd building. So I hope you will also join us for those presentations as well. Tonight, I'm very pleased to present Carla Stellweg, who teaches in the art history department at SVA. She drew my attention to the work of Terence Gower and played a key role in organizing tonight's event. So please help me in welcoming Carla, who will introduce tonight's speakers. Thank you.
This is indeed a huge, intimidating space. Good evening and welcome to everybody. And I would like to start by especially thanking Isabel Tauby. I didn't know you pronounced it Tauby. And Brett Schneider, who in the absence of our chair, Tom Yoon, have provided us with all the support to enable this evening's program. Much appreciated y gracias. And on behalf of the SVA department, I am very, very honored to introduce Claire Bishop, who is an art historian, a critic, and a professor in the PhD program in art history at the City University of New York Graduate Center in New York. Previously, Ms. Bishop was an associate professor in the Department of Art History at the University of Warwick, Coventry, and visiting professor in the Curating Contemporary Art Department at the Royal College of Art in London. She's authored the highly regarded volumes Installation Art, A Critical History, 2005, and Participation, 2006. Plus, she's a contributor to many art journals, including Art Forum, Flash Art, and October. Her essay, Antagonism and Relational Aesthetics, which appeared in October in 2004, apparently really caused a furor in the art community, the critical theory community that is, and remains an influential critique of relational aesthetics. Her most recent book, Artificial Health, Participatory Art and Politics of Spectatorship, came out in 2012 with Verso and earned her the College Art Association's 2013 Frank Jewett Mather Award for Art Criticism. Her curatorial projects include the performance exhibition Double Agent at the ICA in London and the Prelude 11 Performance Festival at the City University of New York Graduate Center. I think it was in conjunction with Performa 11. But what was especially inspiring to me, and I didn't know prior to reading more about Claire's activities, is that she is familiar with a lot of Latin American artists who are indeed today working all the different formats of performative art that she, in her books, has outlined and discussed and debated and critiqued. And in particular, Tania Bruguera, but what I was, the younger generation that is, but what I was also really surprised about is her knowledge of the art history of performative and participatory art in Argentina, beginning with Oscar Mazota, who is one of my all-time favorites. And yeah, I was wondering if you ever knew of Greco. He was also a performance artist. Yeah, fantastic one. I didn't see it in any of the references that you have. Her most recent book, Radical Museology, or What is Contemporary in Museums of Contemporary Art, has just been published by Koenig Books. So I stand corrected, the other book was an earlier book. I'm hoping that her conversations with Terence tonight will spark our audience to also listen to her June 13, 2013 taped conversation with Jacques Rancière at the Tate Modern in London. It was organized in conjunction of the English translation of Rancière's Aestheses, Scenes from the Aesthetic Revolution of Art, which appeared in Verso 2013. The taped interview is on Claire's blog, for those of you who follow Rancière on the subject of relational aesthetics. And it is a rare opportunity to gain more insight into Claire's critical practice and how Rancière understands the aesthetics of how art has been identified historically, such as the criteria collectively produced within a constellation of institutions, industries, market forces, and the perceptions of individuals and groups. So moving on to Terence, I am also extremely pleased to introduce him. He is an artist who originally is from Canada, but has lived and worked in Mexico and Latin America, as well as in New York. I believe that we first met in Mexico City, where he arrived in 1993, but it may have also been in New York, where he settled in 95, or perhaps it was even in Guadalajara. I'm not quite certain. What I do know, and what is certain, is that in Mexico we ran in the same circles, though I had arrived there decades earlier and moved to New York in 1982. But I continue to work with Mexico a lot, and Latin America. There are several threads that run throughout our careers that brought me to organize this presentation tonight. For one, our joint interest in art and architecture versus models of modernity. And second, we go back and forth from Mexico to New York, traveling through Latin America and Europe, creating projects here and there as both insiders and outsiders. We're both still, however, part of a forever growing group of people from around the world who have made Mexico part of their lives and work. So for those of you, and several of you asked me, what is Terence doing being presented as part of the Latin American career that I have practiced? I'm sure that this will tell you enough about that. I mean, he certainly shares a lot of the interests that we all have.
I'll start with the Mexico part.
Okay. Then to go back to the relationship between art and architecture, in 1972, when I co-founded and edited the English-Spanish contemporary art journal Artes Visuales for the Museo de Arte Moderno in Mexico City, architecture was an integral part of its mission and vision. One major influence was Matthias Goeritz, who had been one of my mentors in Mexico. It took several issues before this magazine came into its own and took its avant-garde stance debating issues of what were then prevalent in Mexico, of a national art, a Mexican art that was national, countering its overriding prevalence with what we began branding as Latin American art, a continuation of the ideas implicit in earlier Pan-Americanism, or the attempts towards Pan-Americanism. All the while, architecture, as well as popular visual culture, remained at the core of the magazines. And these are the topics that are also of concern to Terence, which you will see in his presentation. When I first encountered his work, I immediately observed his unique method or modus operandi in which he combines ideas regarding the formation of a modern nation with the transformations of visual cultural forms that this process embraced, and which at that time were most prominent in the architecture of Mexico and Latin America, resulting in collaborations on monumental urban projects by both artists and architects. His earlier projects were historical research-based, but since have become archival-based and taken the form of curatorial installations, reaching far into areas beyond Mexico and Latin America to produce some of the most amazing works in the field, which he will share with us tonight, some of which he will share. For instance, what comes to mind is the Wilderness Utopia, which is a fictional prospectus for Hirschhorn, Ontario, a town planned in 1955 for the wilderness of Canada, but it was never built. The town was the brainchild of Joseph Hirshhorn, the uranium tycoon and founder of the Hirshhorn Museum in DC. The town was designed to serve two purposes: to house the flood of miners brought in to work in the newly opened uranium mines, and to provide a setting for Hirschhorn's famous collection of modern art. I'm not sure if Terence will talk about this project, but if he doesn't, then you can definitely see that also on his website. Okay. Now, when Terence actually stands up and performs in his videos that deal with these issues, he delivers his point many times in a hilarious deadpan manner. And that sense of humor was also part of a collaboration that he had with the writer Monica de la Torre, who's an editor of Bomb magazine, on an anthology of meaningless book marketing blurbs, reviews of dubious exhibitions, evil-spirited notes by editors and critics, and obsessional letters addressed to a psychiatrist. When he arrived in Mexico in 1993, just to give you a little context of the world that he found in Mexico, is very distinct from the one that I found when I first went to Mexico. It was just before the Zapatistas launched their army of national liberation in Chiapas 94, followed the next year by a devastating 8-point on the Richter scale Mexico City earthquake. Those were the days of President Carlos Salinas de Gortari, one of the most unpopular of all of Mexico's presidents and the one who opened the door to a full-fledged neoliberal political economical system. He's responsible for pushing the signing of NAFTA, the free trade agreement with Canada and US and Mexico, that to this day, almost all Mexicans view as the beginning of a seriously decreased standard of living, economic hardships for a majority of the population, rise of the drug trade, and the massive corruption, all of which basically ensued during Carlos Salinas de Gortari's administration. Coincidentally, and also in 1995, the first international art fair was staged in Mexico in the city of Guadalajara. And there has to be some connection between the free trade and the art fair business, which is another subject. But I would sort of venture to say that all of these circumstances that Terence has been a part of and that were part of his living experience, somehow or another are also visible in the work to a certain degree in terms of his ideological and political stance. He has participated in numerous exhibitions, which I will not list all of them because I know that we have limited time. Just to say that he has participated in the Mercosur and Havana biennials, numerous exhibitions all over the world in museums, nonprofits, galleries, and alternative spaces. And he's represented in Mexico by a very prestigious gallery today that does indeed a lot of work with art and architecture called Labor. Major public commission from the New York School Construction Authority will be inaugurated in September of 2013. And I will not list all of his books and publications. So without much further ado, please join me in welcoming Terence and Claire.
Thank you, Carla.
Should we say something about how we're going to structure this?
Yeah, let's. I was going to quickly mention the format. We're going to do a little bit of a hybrid format tonight. As you can see, we're both on stage together. Rather than me kind of getting into the podium and presenting the work, and then Claire responding, I'm going to present.
It's more of a talk show.
Exactly. She's going to correct me and ask me questions as we go
chip
along.
in with questions, and then we might do a little bit of role reversal, where Terence asks me some questions, and then we'll open it up to you.
Exactly. So I have about probably 30 minutes of material. I'm going to start with a small project on Mexico City in honor of Carla and her introduction, just to kind of talk about where I was, show you what I was working with 20 years ago when I came there. And then quickly run through some work from the interim period, and then I'm going to show you a lot of research from two more recent projects, including the Hirshhorn project. So you'll get to see that in more in depth, and we'll look at the video as well. So, by the way, thank you, Isabel, Brett, Carla, for organizing this. Thank you, Claire, for being here as well. I'm going to start with this journal project on this Mexican architect named Francisco Artigas. And I think this is a good place to start because you can see two of the kind of my intersecting interests in post-war architecture and culture coming about in this piece. So this project came out of an invitation from the Archives of American Art in Washington to do a journal project and work with their archives. And when I looked at the finding aid, I discovered that they have the papers of Esther McCoy, who is a West Coast architecture historian, very central in the Case Study House program in California. And I knew that she had there was a lot of back and forth with Latin America as well, and I knew she'd gone to Mexico. And because I had seen her, she had written the introduction to this monograph by this architect. This is Francisco Artigas. This is a house he does design in Pedregal, a neighborhood in the south of Mexico City, in a lava landscape.
And when's it built?
1953, and it's the Gomez house, this one. And the project, so one of the things that's one of my main interests in this period is this kind of entropy that occurred as modern architecture was sort of corporatized, as it was taken on by different architects and kind of used and abused in different ways. In Mexico was a particularly interesting case, and when I arrived there, I was immediately drawn to the architecture and kind of launched this large research project on Mexican modernism. And I was particularly interested in how it kind of, for a certain sector of society, modern architecture symbolized kind of progress. It was sophisticated, it was chic, and so wealthy people would have their houses designed in the modern style. And that's so this is, I'm interested in this kind of breakdown where the kind of philosophy of modernism becomes a style, and we see it very much happening in Mexico. So the project is actually, I'm taking too long.
Can we back up?
Yeah.
Because I mean, I'm a real novice here. What I know about architecture is through artists like Terence and all of these, like the kind of seemingly ever expanding body of contemporary art that is about modernist architecture. So to think about modernist architecture in Mexico City, the kind of works that you focus on are from the 50s and 60s onwards.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to that, there is what? What kind of form does it take?
So it's interesting because I'm working on a pre First World War project right now on what the so-called Bauhaus style of architecture of Tel Aviv. That work pre-war was closer to the roots of the modern movement.
And there's a substantial amount of that still in Mexico?
From that period, it's interesting.
Yeah.
It's interesting actually because there was in Mexico's a place where there was a revolution in the teens, and there was a period of kind of searching for a style that would represent the new kind of revolutionary culture. And there was a look at kind of, can we work with kind of indigenous forms, et cetera, and there was a kind of general consensus that we would settle on functionalism. And that's kind of what fascinated me when we arrived in Mexico was the official architecture was modern, unlike what you see in countries like the US and other countries. So Mexico is a particularly interesting case in that sense.
Right.
And then going into the post-war period, you see these kind of functionalism entering the
Private
the private sphere, and then of course for public architecture. So I always talk about these kind of two branches of modernism in Mexico. So I'm going to run very quickly through the project. It was the piece is called The Castle. It's Esther McCoy's first encounter with the house of Artigas, and Artigas was a kind of icon of modern architecture in Mexico, designed these very beautiful houses like this. But when it came time to design his own house, this was in the late 60s, he designed this, which was a kind of, he described as an Italianate castle. And here's an interior shot. So these are taken from the Smithsonian archives and put together in this journal piece. The idea is to play with the idea of the play. So here's the cover of the book. It's called The Castle. And then here's the main soliloquy, and it's actually a transcript of Esther McCoy entering the house and her first encounter with the house, and her kind of the idea of the drama of her disappointment with the work of Artigas, and this idea that kind of the modern project was kind of not a ruse, but it was a style among other styles that he could be working in. He wasn't committed to the cause, is what she discovered, and it registers in the voice. So I've transcribed it as a kind of dramatic soliloquy in a play.
Can you give us a burst? Because I can't read it.
It's actually verbatim, so it's opening front door and peering inside. The passage is covered with wood and glass at the sides. Pause. Planting both sides. Columns of old beams carved with acanthus. And she's describing all these elements in the architecture. Of course, are not steel and glass, and not like is it the other work of Artigas. There's an essay that accompanied the piece as well, and amazingly with this big screen, you can read the essay on the screen, which is great. Those are the tapes from her visit to the house. And then finally, in her interview, and on the tapes, in an interview with him, she said, what got into your mind? Why did you design a castle for yourself? And he said, I always wanted to live in Robin Hood's castle, starting in the 30s. And this is Errol Flynn in Robin Hood. I think it's 1938. And I won't go into it, but there is a long history as well of kind of architecture coming out of film in Mexico and kind of Hollywood. There's a whole style called Hollywood Baroque that you see around the city, which is great. So as you can see, there's this kind of breakdown that interested me, and you see it all over Mexico, certainly all over the world.
And a breakdown that's typical for that particular historical moment of the 50s?
I think so. I mean, one of the figures actually I'm going to talk about in a minute is who was involved in the Hirshhorn Project was Philip Johnson. I think he was a figure who was instrumental in that. So he kind of right from the very beginning, he was one of the main instruments in bringing modern architecture and awareness of modern architecture to the U.S. and disseminating it with that very early show he did at MoMA.
But I'm just confused. So you've got the beautiful house that you opened with on the first screen. It looks like that inside. No, that house?
No, this is that.
Oh,
this is his most iconic house.
Okay, and then this is when it's degenerated into.
This is when he's like, oh, now I can finally design my own
Okay.
house. This is what I want. After doing all these like beautiful slabs for my clients,
Yeah.
now I'm going to design this kind of fussy hexagonal
and this dates
Italian
from the 60s?
castle. This is 69. Yeah.
Okay.
And there's an interior. And again, if you're familiar, kind of with the bourgeoisie in Mexico, it's quite common this kind of house and furnishing. So this is very quickly. I'm just going to run through, not dwell so much on these. I'm going to kind of run through the slides. This is just to familiarize you that don't know my work with a couple of kind of more important projects in the past. This piece is called the Bicycle Pavilion, and it was a commission from a private collection in Mexico called the Jumex Collection. And it was designed as an interface between the Jumex factory, where they make juice, actually, and the museum where they house their collection. It's actually in this place where the two kind of groups, the factory workers and the visitors to the museum, can interact. The factory workers, of course, hang their bicycles, there you see, in the pavilion. Another Mexico project. These shots are from an installation at the New Museum. This was just shown in Sweden at Tensta, and it's actually a prototype for a piece on Tlatelolco. And the idea is this idea of mass housing. These are cardboard boxes that are printed with these very beautiful facade motifs of the Tlatelolco housing complex in Mexico City, designed by Mario Pani. There's a kind of schematic of the installation. And then, starting about 10 years ago, 8 years ago, I started producing much more, focusing more on the U.S. and Europe and the Middle East and these other projects. I continue, of course, to go back and work in Mexico and show there and continue on that project. But I've kind of taken the same method into these other areas of the world and looking at the same period. Architecture and culture from that period. So I don't know if you recognize this. It's on 26th Street.
I just walked past it.
There you go. This is it's called Chelsea Elliott Houses. It's a project by William LaSaze, who designed the famous PSFS building in Philadelphia, the first kind of modern, kind of functionalist skyscraper in the U.S. in the 30s. He did this in 47, and it was quite an important early housing complex, not long after the Housing Act was signed. So I've done a lot of research on housing, and you'll see a couple of projects related to that. My project, I was interested in this idea of the going back to early visionaries like Hilbersheimer and the early Plan Voisin of Le Corbusier, and this idea of the kind of single solution, this idea of a universal solution to all these different kind of social problems, one of them being logement, housing. And I started to fantasize about this idea of, well, what if you can just kind of roll it out endlessly? So you can see it here, I took those blocks from the Chelsea Elliott house as a model and turned them into kind of a endless wallpaper pattern. You see it installed here. This is the Budapest Kunsthal. And the idea is you can as you apply the wallpaper, it's kind of like a planning performance. I like to think of it. So, and it just kind of goes on endlessly. So we can have more and more and more and more housing. Of course, it's for an early planner, it would maybe be a fantasy. For many other people, it would be a
But it's not actually installed in the mode of a performance where
no.
viewers can see this being
It's a
installed.
nice idea, though. Yeah. Also the pattern is from a distance is kind of like this garland pattern. It's a very kind of pre-modern pattern. I like the idea of that it could be used in a public housing apartment to kind of break the austerity, which is what you often see. People kind of go to early pre-modern design in these complexes.
What's going on here?
This is just a still from New Utopias, which I don't have time to show you, but just to give you. And this is, I think Carla mentioned that I've been appearing in my own work more recently. This is a piece done about 3 years ago as a kind of manifesto for this new body of work on sculpture and post-war abstraction that I've been working on. And I analyzed 3 film. You've seen this, no? Okay.
No.
3 different films, and I talk about the central structures that appear in those films, or whether they're architectural structures or engineering structures, as kind of signifiers of the utopias that appear in the film. The piece is called New Utopias, and I'm looking at very unlikely examples from the 70s, like the Rocky Horror Picture Show is a sort of sexual Marcusean utopia or something like that. So.
But
and
here
the list goes on.
this is like a little Mies Barcelona pavilion,
Yeah.
and Buckminster Fuller, and so.
And so
The point is the mismatch between what you're
So
describing.
these models, there's a kind of disparity between the samples I take. They're all from the 70s. They're specifically from before the arrival of Reagan, basically, when the idea of the 70s was the last moment when we could really dream and have utopias, and then we got serious in the 80s. There's a little clip. There's a clip of it on my site and on the BOM website. I think there's a longer clip on the BOM site. This is a very recent project from Sweden, where I've just created this tableau based on a collage of Mies van der Rohe that's actually up at MoMA right now. You can see it. Using the view from the museum. The museum was designed really to take advantage of the view. It was designed as a forestry museum, and using that as a kind of composition in part of this composition, part of the tableau. These are just a couple of stills from a recent show in Mexico City, and you can see some of the work I've been doing with sculpture. A lot of kind of citation of sculpture. The paper mache pieces are exact copies of Barbara Hepworth's stone sculptures, but done in paper mache. And then this piece is called Noguchi Galaxy, and I'm taking forms from Noguchi as kind of a. I'm interested in these artists as kind of representational of their era, of kind of channeling the moment. So, and then I'm going to start talking about the Hirshhorn Project. Any questions, Claire, or comments? Or?
No, you started to answer them. I was going to say why Hepworth and Noguchi.
Okay.
Is everything available for you to quote, or are there particular? Well, you started to answer it by saying you saw them as particularly representative of their moment.
Yeah, I think, and I talk. I mean, I'm interested in. I have this statement that I made in the text about the Noguchi piece that I see it as a kind of source code for biomorphic modernism. It's like it's there in Noguchi, and you see it all through design afterwards as well. These forms he's working with, and basically I'm taking his kind of slotted together sculptures from the late 40s and exploding them and just kind of and extrapolating these forms from the Noguchi sculptures.
And do you think? Okay, here's a nasty question. Do you think you are channeling your moment by appropriating or quoting them now?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And what would that mean? What do you think that you're channeling about our present cultural moment that involves going back and taking from Hepworth or Noguchi or Mies van der Rohe?
So yeah, and this is a good moment to talk about this because it's one of the issues that we've been discussing, and it's Claire has this interest in artists and a huge group of artists now working with this kind of retrospective gaze and analysis, looking at especially this period. And for me, it's a mixture of things. It's like I said, it's this I'm interested in that moment in modernism, that moment of entropy. I'm interested in when buildings, when sculptures started kind of representing things other than themselves, especially when abstraction is used in that way or is given that possibility.
You mean
I'm-
when
sorry.
abstraction gets corporate?
No, when
Not
it's
quite.
when it has meanings kind of attached to it, whether by the artist
Right.
or through accumulation, through living its life. Like we said, I mean, these forms come to represent their era in some ways, and that's interesting to me. So, and what aspects of the era. I'm also always looking, and you'll see it in the second longer project I'll show here is basically looking at positive models from the past, progressive
Okay.
models. I think we have a tendency to sort of reinvent the wheel in history and culture. And so I believe we need to constantly be looking at history, at our history, and in the cultural realm, we need to constantly be looking at kind of our roots and where we come from, what our influences have been, and then of course I mean, we're collaborating really as artists and writers. What kind of progress was made in the past, and how can we kind of continue on from that? I guess it's kind of a pretty utopian idea. This is one of the two projects I'm going to show you more in depth. I'm going to show you more some images from the research, and I think there'll be a number of things to talk about here. So this was a commission from the Hirshhorn Museum. It actually opened the day after Obama was elected in 2008. So it was a very stressful installation. We didn't know what kind of world we were going to end up with in the next day. So, and we're in Washington as well. Just some shots, some nice Ezra Stoller images of the Hirshhorn when it first opened. Also, I'm always looking at original documentation, the original documents, again as a kind of signifier, or kind of something that somehow channels the ideas of the period, especially in the kind of period documentation of buildings. So as Carla mentioned, the sponsor of the Hirshhorn Museum, or the man that was responsible for its founding, was Joseph Hirschhorn. And here's a picture of him in action, making money in one of his uranium mines in Canada. So when I started to do research on the Hirshhorn Museum, I knew there would be an interesting story about the building itself, kind of on the mall, in this most kind of charged site in the whole country. And there's kind of giant, what they call a concrete donut in Washington. There was all sorts of craziness and scandal and kind of right-wing conspiracies and all sorts of things just to stop the museum from being built, anti-Semitism even. But then I started investigating Hirschhorn's personal story. I don't know how much you know about his past, but he was
Nothing.
he was a Latvian Jew that came over to the U.S. around the turn of the last century. Absolute kind of rags to riches story. He was in the slums in Brooklyn with 7 siblings and started as a runner in the curbside stock exchange downtown in New York. And by age 25, made his first million. So he was like a rapid rise. And then cashed out before the crash and took his money to Canada and started speculating in mining. And so there's a kind of Canadian connection. And so when I started realizing this, of course, it started to resonate more with me as a Canadian growing up in this period when it was like resources, Cold War. These were the big issues of growing up in Canada in the 70s and 80s. And Hirschhorn was a kind of perfect convergence of these as this figure of these different issues. This is where he went. To this, so basically this is where the money comes from for the Hirshhorn Museum. So at the same time as reading the Hirshhorn different biographies and going into the archives, I started to realize this was the money for that collection, for that museum, came from uranium. It came from uranium at a particular time during the arms race and the lead up to the bomb as well. And could we say that Hirshhorn was maybe a bit of a arms profiteer, and that's where the money came from? It was interesting. So okay, well now we have the opportunity to make a kind of little institutional critique at the Hirshhorn. So there was another kind of political angle that emerged in the project. This is in Northern Ontario, the site where his largest uranium discovery was made. He made something like $150 million in 1953, in like a month, which was a lot back then. Now it's not so much. But. So the research. So here's the site, and once Hirschhorn made his money, he decided to build a town at the site of the uranium mines, a kind of utopian town of culture. And so it's interesting because this was probably the first large project I did after kind of really moving my practice to New York and to the U.S. from, starting to work more intensively in the U.S. And I had really been focusing on public architecture from the post-war period. And here's an example of basically a public site funded and built by a private person. So immediately I found this kind of most complicated structure possible. So the project is called Public Spirit. And that I think, unearths a number of problematics. I mean, there's been a lot written recently about kind of private space, et cetera, private space for public.
So what date is this, when he's planning this?
The 55. So it was August 55 when the project was announced. And so it's a very interesting moment because it's a very interesting project because it's extremely problematic in that it is a completely privately funded space, but he's totally public spirited. He's like, we're going to have schools, and it's compared to other mining towns are generally total backwaters with like trailers and so he wanted to build this beautiful city and educate the miners' kids and buy like Etruscan vases and put them in the museum, in the Hirshhorn Museum in the middle of the town. And I was interested in that kind of altruism for Hirshhorn, and then of course the dark side of that as well.
Because it was never built.
It was never built. So here's the town layout and at the site, and then here are the original shots of the original model of the town. This is where Philip Johnson comes into the narrative because he was the commissioned architect. So these are his models for the town. He was at that point, 1955. He'd done his, he'd gone off to Germany and been a Nazi for 10 years. After founding the modern architecture department at MoMA, he had his little kind of fascist political career, and then he came back to the U.S., did his Harvard degree, and then became kind of like architect to high society. So it was the Rockefellers, Manils. So if you had a big project, you called Philip Johnson. And there was a moment of hesitation for Hirshhorn because of this Johnson's Nazi connections in his past. Hirshhorn having left Latvia at the moment of the pogroms and being rather sensitive to anti-Semitism, of course. That's another story, but it's very interesting. I'm actually doing a big Johnson project now that's going into that a little bit more. For this project, I really concentrate on his design, but I like to think of the town project as maybe as an expression or an experiment in his kind of megalomania. He's famous for his Nietzsche obsession, and for maybe this is an expression of Johnson's kind of Übermensch, the idea of controlling the little people. So he was I think this was his interest in urbanism. He also around this time he did a project he did the planning for Roosevelt Island in New York.
So these designs are by who?
Johnson, by Philip Johnson.
This is okay.
Yeah.
So, okay. When you said it like he gets involved, I thought maybe there was already a scheme and then
No.
he comes and consults, but no.
No, he actually, Hirshhorn went to Johnson, and I'll show you in a minute a project that he actually did design and build at the site. Different views of the model. And the model was essential for my project because I'll show you in a minute that we kind of rebuilt the town to analyze it. This is great. I love that you can read these. This is Hirshhorn's original brief for the construction of the town that he submitted to the Ontario government. I'll tell you right now, the project was canceled partly because the Ontario government said no. They said, this is totally insane. Of course you can't build an entire city without our approval. And there's so much press, I'll show you some of the press in a minute, and so much excitement around it when it happened that the government completely freaked out. They were like, started putting the brakes on, of course, for somebody like Hirschhorn that just made him walk away. He just lost interest. The minute there was some kind of opposition and people weren't accepting his gift, he just kind of walked away from the project. But I love the prose in this. In keeping with the concept of model town, this town will be planned toward happy living by John P. Parkin Associates. So Parkin is actually collaborating with Philip Johnson. And it's that idea of, there's that kind of utopian moment, that happy living, which I love. These are early schemes for the town. I'll just go through them quickly. It actually gives you a good look at how spread out Philip Johnson's archive is as well. It's all over the place. It's like Getty, MoMA, Hirschorn. And then a couple of the Ecstatic newspaper announcements. These would have been from like summer 1955. And so central to the town was culture. And this, if it hadn't been, would have been the Hirshhorn Museum. It would have been the original Hirshhorn Museum. That's where the collection would have been housed. So part of my project was to kind of imagine what that Hirshhorn Museum would have been in 1955. The Hirshhorn in Washington opened in 1974. It started planning in 66, and with all sorts of troubles along the way in the construction, et cetera. There's Hirshhorn with Dean Acheson. Some mining, speculating. This is the early speculating imagery from the archives. And then the last element in the research, of course, was, which we can't ignore, what happens when you mine uranium. Of course, it's there's obviously they didn't know in '55, but very soon found out that there are terrible health and ecological implications to mining this particular mineral.
Okay, so you have all this research. How is this exhibited?
So that's coming up next. So this was a parallel town. This is called Kitimat, BC, that it was compared to when it was announced. Just to give you an idea of what it would have felt like if it were built. There's a shot from Kitimat. Kitimat actually is not far from where I grew up in BC. So again, it resonated in that way. And then this is Slin in the Czech Republic, which it was compared to as well. So how was it exhibited?
Yes.
Good point. 4 showcases, and this is something we've been talking about. 4 showcases, 2 models, and these are large models. They're 1 to 10 models of the 2 principal buildings, and then there are the models, and then a video which is 3 minutes long, and I'm going to show you. So, in this case, I had this body of research. I had of course, artists work. Some artists work a little bit like writers, where you kind of you read, then you analyze it, then you work out your argument, and then you write. Instead of writing, we create whatever we create. So, I basically had 3 messages I wanted to send with the project. One was a just information-based one, which is the presentation of the research, and this is exactly one of the things that Claire's been investigating is the presentation of research in artist installations and why. And so this is, it's funny because when we were communicating through the blog, I think it was, now I see it kind of, it is partly that, look at all the work I've done. Isn't it incredible?
Yes.
Like, here it is, you've done all this stuff behind the scenes and you kind of want to put it out there. Writers don't do that. It's interesting. You don't.
No.
Well, your footnotes maybe. Your
Yeah,
bibliography.
That's
at the
true.
end.
You do it in footnotes.
Yeah.
And you get very attached to footnotes, proving that you've done the research.
Yeah.
I did go to this archive.
Exactly.
Sadly, I didn't find anything there, but I was there. And
Or you do a presentation like this where you can show all the archives.
Yeah.
And stuff. Exactly.
Yeah. So one was informational. Yeah, you
Yeah.
said you had 3 messages to put out.
So,
What were
so
other
the
2?
showcase was, and it was a little bit. I was interested in the idea that the viewer could kind of do their own research. There's very much there's a message running through the showcases. There's a kind of almost like an essay that runs through. There's quite a bit of text guiding the viewer. So a very basic information-based thing. I wanted a kind of physical, sculptural representation of that place, Hirshhorn, Ontario, and that was through the sculptures. I'll show you some details in a second. Something that the viewer could relate to with their body and not just with their kind of cognitive senses. And then the third, I wanted to give a kind of emotional experience of what that place was like. I'll run through this very quickly because we're actually running late. So the showcases look like this. Basic documentation from some of the stuff I showed you from the construction of the town. This was showcase 2 was about the history of uranium in Canada and uranium mining, and of course the fallout at the end of that. Showcase 3 was about the art collection in 1955. So what would the collection of the original Hirshhorn Museum have looked like? And you see it also works in that period in the video. And then finally, the fourth vitrine was on a building that was built at the site, which was Hirschhorn's personal house, called the Guest House, designed by Philip Johnson. Here's some shots, and there's Hirschhorn with wife and daughters and dog. The sculpture, as you can see, was to give this kind of physical, a kind of physical experience to the viewer of what those buildings were like, and this is what they look like, built in aluminum. The tallest one was 10 feet high, and this is where they live now, in the country at a collector's house, in the outdoors, which is kind of where I'd wanted to see them in the first place. Very quickly, to build the buildings in the video, we had to kind of rely on details from Philip Johnson's contemporary work. So here's some of the houses. The St. Thomas University, with its kind of covered walkways, is what we used. And then for the housing, I found the exact model was the Harvey residence, and Johnson would repeat his designs over and over. And then finally, I think this is the last image, this is the kind of joke. Like I said, Johnson was kind of, he was an elitist. He was the Übermensch. And so in the kind of humble miner's apartment, I've transposed his furniture grouping from the glass house, from his own house, as a kind of like, okay, we're going to give the public housing, let's really do public housing and put Philip Johnson's furniture in there. That's the Hirshhorn Project.
Okay, I think rather than asking you questions, maybe we should push on and get through the third case study and then
Okay.
then have a general conversation.
Okay, very quickly. So the research for this project, this is large project number 2 I'm presenting. The research for this came out of a Guggenheim grant to research the embassies, U.S. embassies that were built around the world in the post-war period. The place this was first shown was at the Haus der Kultur der Welt in Berlin. Here's a period photo and a couple of period interiors. This is actually the site where we did the installation of the piece. And like I was saying, looking at kind of progressive models from the past, there was a moment in the post-war period where the State Department was hiring the best and most cutting-edge architects to design embassies around the world. This was the model before the war, with these kind of plantation-style houses. So this is actually the embassy in New Zealand. And then this is the most recent, where we are now, and what I'd call citadel style, which is actually the consulate, believe it or not, in Istanbul. And this is the norm now. So there's a period from starting in the post-war, and again, it's kind of architecture and architectural language representing or symbolizing something that's always kind of underlying the interest here. The State Department put together some design directives calling for things like glass walls and transparency and free access and open doors, and they wanted people to. This is the post-war period. We're the new superpower, and we want to show that. We also want to show this kind of like benign. We also are making information available. It was about the free flow of information, as a sending a sign to the Soviet Union. So it was really about kind of creating these open embassies. And then very quickly, because embassies are kind of like a mini US government, we have all branches, and we have the CIA and the FBI there, of course. And the CIA, while they were upstairs in this kind of beautiful glass embassy welcoming the public, and the CIA is downstairs plotting the overthrow of the local government. So this is what occasioned the beginning of some retaliation, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I'm simplifying it enormously, but, and later I'll show you how I've kind of charted those events. And so we went to fortification in about 1985 is when the embassies started getting fortified. But there was this kind of golden age for the last about 20 years of these very beautiful embassy buildings. Dublin on the upper left. These are from this book by Jane Loeffler, who's like kind of the specialist on embassy design. Stockholm on the lower right. And these are, he was, Rapson at this point was a young architect just starting his practice, and the State Department gave him an embassy commission. This is Bundschaft's Frankfurt embassy, or consulate. And then I came across this embassy, which is incredible, and found out it was designed by José Luis Sert, the Catalan architect who'd been in the US about 10 years when the State Department approached him to design a US embassy for Baghdad. And this is the ambassador's residence of a much larger complex. So, of course, because of recent events, the last 20 years history in Iraq, this was a very clear way of showing kind of where we've come, or how things have devolved ideologically for the U.S. and especially in its foreign relations. So we could kind of chart the kind of diplomatic breakdown in between the two countries through the architecture, through this kind of exchange of architecture. So this is Sert's original brief, his report, basically, when he started the embassy project. He started it in 1955. And they had this policy of actually sending architects to the site to kind of get the local vibe and look at the different conditions and the kind of building history, et cetera, of those sites, which I think is kind of radical. When you look at what was going on before and what's going on now in embassy design, it was kind of like, let's build something that really fits with the site. So it's really interesting. It's like, wow, was there actually a moment of enlightenment in the State Department in the 50s? Like, could that be true? And it appears that, yes, to a certain degree. Here's the plan for the compound. It's right on the Tigris. Later I'll show you a map, one of the early sketches. And so in writing, in the texts that have been written about this complex, there's very little, actually. Many people don't know this building. They talk about the roof structure as an Islamic-inspired roof. And when I first saw it, I said, no way, that's a kind of Festival of Britain, tent festival architecture kind of thing. And there it is. But when you look at it from above, you start to see that it is this kind of multiple dome structure, which has a function, of course. Here are some examples: the bazaar and the caravanserai. And then it has there's a kind of pattern that you can see, and there's a kind of marquetry quality to the roof. And so this is a detail of the sculpture that I produced based on the roof form of the ambassador's residence. So the sculpture. There's the original. On the left is the actual roof form. In the middle is the rectangle completed, and then on the right is the kind of diagram for the sculpture itself. And so I was thinking of that roof as the kind of fulcrum or this kind of that kind of point of dialogue between local culture and the U.S. in a way. So this is somehow it's abstracted, but it somehow can is this sort of hinge in a way between the two cultures. Just some details. The piece is plywood veneered with cedar, which is of course the traditional cedar is traditional wood of marquetry in Islamic countries. And then mounted on this very fancy brass structure, so it feels like a kind of modern room divider that you'd see in a fancy house in Copenhagen or something. So the installation, I'll go through this very quickly, and I'll just mention a couple of kind of Iraq-specific elements that are presented in the installation. So we have the screen, this kind of room divider in cedar. We have furniture groupings. The furniture groupings was partly they come from the site of the original installation, which was the House de Couture, which is another story that I don't have time to tell now, but was a building that was built as a kind of propaganda tool by the U.S. as a gift to the German people. Do you know the story of the Kongresshalle? And then given to the people of Berlin as this kind of, it was called by the architect Hugh Stubbins as the shining beacon of freedom directed towards the east. You know, it's like total, like sickening propaganda. And the Berliners just said thanks very much and really started using it for communication for these different things. And the mayor of Berlin at the time, you know, made a statement. It's like, great, this is wonderful. Well, you know, and didn't use it as this kind of ideological tool, but used it actually really to communicate, you know, in different ways. There are a million different kind of meeting areas and auditoria, and including these kind of informal areas. And so these were part of the original scheme to generate kind of informal discussion. And so you see some of the original furniture in the installation.
And vitrines,
And then the vitrines
which
contain there are
the
10
research
vitrines.
materials.
Exactly. That's exactly it. So they're integrated. So it's kind of like the centerpiece is the sculpture, and then we have our research. The research is divided in two. It's a long shot. It's in an area called the Café Global, which is a very beautiful part of the building. The first part deals with documentation on the building, mostly coming from the Harvard Sarah Archive at the GSD in Harvard. The photographs, you see them here, that I decided to tint them red, which was a strategy used in architecture publications in the period that this was built, to create kind of dynamic compositions when we didn't have 3-color printing. So it was like just like make it a red photograph instead of a black and white photograph. Something else I discovered in the research was this wonderful kind of register of the life of the photograph that you see on the back. You kind of see the different magazines it's gone to where it's been reproduced. They weren't actually reproduced in that many places. The photos. So there's a really nice kind of the history of the actual photograph as a document. And this has been written a lot about the Barcelona Pavilion, for instance, which was torn down, built in 29, and then torn down in 30, and then kind of existed only in photographs. And people talked about the life of the photograph for many years of those buildings. So here's an actual physical example. The site plan, done in cedar again, with fluorescent orange boxes to represent the buildings. And then the second group of vitrines represent a little bit of that history. So I've kind of touched down in a few places in U.S.-Iraq relations to kind of, you know, these few kind of points that I feel kind of illustrate the devolution of relations between the two countries that led, of course, up to the completely illegal attack, invasion, and occupation of the one country by the other. The first is this this 3-part chart, and this is the chart that charts U.S. embassy construction in the middle line, U.S. interventions in foreign territory on the bottom, and then attacks on U.S. foreign property on the top line. And so they're kind of registered, so you can actually trace, and the chart buckles where there's a kind of peak of activity. Here's a detail. So when there are a particular number of attacks, the chart kind of like peaks up at that point, and you can see there's a lot of embassy construction. In this period that I'm studying when the Iraq embassy was built, a lot of U.S. interventions just post-war. And then again, so it goes up to 85 when the embassy started, when they started fortifying the embassies, the program changed.
The thing that strikes me with this project, especially of the ones that you've presented, is the huge difference between listening to an artist narrate their research and show
Yep.
us images, and the job of being a viewer, piecing all of this together as we look at vitrines and walk around a gallery space. How do you negotiate that difference, or do you just pessimistically accept that it's there's quite a qualitative difference between the two?
They're two different animals, really. I think the idea, for me, the idea is always to give as much information as possible and make it, and it's up to the viewer. I mean, I can't kind of lead them through the hand. We are tonight because I'm here. If they want to come to my talk, or they could go online and read my, my project essays on my web archive. But you can't force the viewer to read. But I like having it there. I like
Okay.
the possibilities there.
So this is an aesthetics of information, yeah? Because are you seriously expecting us to plow through all of this information in vitrines?
Aesthetics is interesting because I hate aestheticizing research and information, but I'm doing it here. You have to kind of make it a little sexier.
Right.
You can, or clearer, like play with this kind of chart idea to kind of illustrate a point in a way other than just like writing it out. So
Because it strikes me as so, paradoxical or ironic, maybe is a better word, that this kind of research-based art has come to the fore in the last 10 to 15 years, precisely as we're trying to cope with so much information online.
yeah.
And that comes over, of course, in the your attention to the mediums, the materiality of the research that you've been accumulating, the way in which you spoke about the life of the photograph and the aura of the stamps on the back of it. And, there's that tactility of the research materials comes to the foreground, but affectively it's a very similar feeling of, oh my God, saturation, too much information. For the viewer, whether it's a screen-based interface or whether it's
When they come
an
into
encounter
this,
with
yeah.
objects in vitrines.
That's interesting because I've never thought. Are you writing? Are you making a correlation in your writing between?
Well,
this
I
kind
have
of
done
this,
in a previous piece.
Between the kind of the online flood of information and this kind of like artists like flooding us with information in installations, because that's exactly what we've been talking about. For me, it's a pretty passive. Maybe it's passive aggressive, but putting out. It's just like laying out the information. The viewer can. 99% of viewers are like, they're media addled anyway. They're not going to read a single thing. But you'll have that 1% or 5% that are going to, especially if you're in a place like Argentina or something, where people are going to read the whole thing. It's amazing. It's happened to me. Berlin, actually, people are big readers. So people really went through and would read the whole. So it's there for those people, but it's very few people, and you can't.
But I find there's a difference between reading something and then am I taking it in? Because you're also skimming when look how much text
For sure.
is in.
Yeah,
in this
wait till you see
display,
the
for
next one.
example.
Exactly. Look at that.
So, there's you feel yourself going through the motions of reading.
Yep.
And I'm not singling you out here. This is a very large tendency of it's very. It's a substantial trend in artistic practice to be presenting this much information and text. So, where am I going with this?
Well,
it looks like the audience is reading it, but are they getting as much out of it as if you were to make more decisions and choices about what information to include and exclude, as you are doing now when you tell us a story? And I think that's why listening to artists talk about their research is much more engaging than looking at research-based art, because you're going through that process of selection and narration for us here.
Well, I'm giving you the project essay, basically. I'm reading it out in a way that's, if you read about the work, if you read about it online or read it, the catalog, you'd be getting this spiel.
But what I find very noticeable in, say, catalog essay writing or magazine articles about research-based art is that people tend to recite the research, recite the project again. They tell us the story, for example, of Hirschhorn, rather than making a comment or telling us about the form of this work and the experience that the viewer is going through or is subjected to by having to consume or being invited to consume this much information.
Yep. I think you're giving, it's like the Hirshhorn installation. You're giving the viewer these different portals in a way into the story,
Yeah.
into the narrative, into that body of research that we did. And one of them is a super processed, intuitive process, which would be the sculpture often, like the sculpture in this installation. The other one is just the kind of flat out information. I think in the Hirshhorn installation it was less sexy, the presentation of the information. Here we're definitely.
It's so funny you say it's sexy, because for me it looks really dry.
I know.
I kind of the total
beautiful
opposite.
then, isn't it?
I know, beautiful, yes, okay, but it's a very austere aesthetic.
Yeah.
I mean, like
I'm
the
glad.
aesthetic of many of the buildings that you're interested in. It's
I'm-
also a very, and the whole, art is dealing with modernist architecture has such a distinctive aesthetic to it that I found now that I've made a massive PowerPoint of all this work. Very muted colors, flashes of red or blue,
Yeah.
Beautiful black and white photographs, depopulated. This is something that's like almost universal, that this question of who is using the space or which bodies are inhabiting the space is elided in favor of these beautiful forms.
That was a convention of the period,
Yeah.
to depopulate in a way. Maybe the romance of the H-bomb or something, I don't
Yeah.
know, but it was really, and there's something, I've worked
But
with
it's
this, with
interesting
the
that
idea of repopulating
Yeah.
that's what Ciudad Moderna, that piece was about,
Yeah.
kind of like reinserting life and people into the standard images that we have of modern architecture. That's really what that video was all about.
And I'm glad you mentioned, Johnson being an elitist, because so often the buildings that are being quoted by artists are building, they're private commissions. These are not, so often it's not public. The most iconic works that keep appearing over and over again in contemporary art are things like the Farnsworth House, or, they're private residencies
True, isn't
or
it?
corporate buildings. And, I know there's a lot of critical cliches about this work being about the failure of modernism, but it's about
we
a
agree on that
celebration
one.
of the private client.
Yeah, we agree on that one.
Yeah.
And a lot of my work a lot of these projects are an answer to that kind of failure of modernism, the failure of modern utopia kind of thing, which I find very clumsy. I think is obviously more complicated than that. But I think you're talking about the seductive aspect of modern design in general for a lot of people. I think I think that's kind of in the back of my mind all the time. Look at real estate advertisements. It's like this project I've done about large red walls in architecture is partly about that kind of. You see it more and more in advertising and things like this. It's like the seduction of the modern. Like we're going back to that. It's very interesting. So I think architects or artists we talked about this kind of dividing practice. There are the purely aesthetic artists with a purely aesthetic interest in modern architecture. There's some with kind of historical, ideological, maybe more my area.
But something that worries me though is how slippery visual forms are. So to be able to read the criticality in a project is quite difficult, especially when we've got a lot of an excess of information accompanying it.
So to read I
mean,
I guess.
Especially when the forms are so seductive. So how do we tell that the artist is taking, a critical position towards this stuff and not just reveling in the beauty of these linear forms and the design aesthetic of the 50s and 60s?
I think most of them, many artists are just reveling in that, and they're selling that. It sells. They do it to
Well,
sell.
I think you see that particularly in painting, and there's a lot of painting
Totally.
that quotes
Yeah.
the stuff,
Very
more
much
so
so.
than in the research installation type.
And for me, I'm reveling in it in a kind of perhaps like I said, a kind of. Is it a kind of signifier of a progressive moment in the past when you compare it with the recent past? I've just got a couple more. I'm going to actually this is a good point actually to show you the last couple of slides on this piece. This all came out of some other research. So this vitrine was the kind of about the legal apparatus for the lead up to the Iraq invasion. It's called the Iraq Liberation Act. And signed, and it was signed by Clinton in 1998, and it was a moment of weakness. It was the Lewinsky scandal, and he basically had a gun to his head by the Republican Congress and forced him to sign this thing. And this particular piece is really about that. The project to take over Iraq had been something in development already for about 10 years. actually for 12 years when the invasion actually happened in 2003. Just some of the documents so it's kind of an illustration of that breakdown. Rumsfeld and Saddam Hussein, of course. A friend is like the enemy of an enemy is our friend. That was kind of foreign policy for a lot of people for a lot of time. That was the kind of breakdown, the 80s. These are just some of the documents from the CIA and the UN that are even available online, a lot of them, that kind of chart that whole history of the invasion. And then the kind of, I wanted to, just a quick narrative that kind of described the delirium leading to the actual attack and invasion, which was and it couldn't be done any better than using New York Post covers. So I kind of infiltrated the Post using the Guggenheim grant, like scholar thing, and they actually sent me PDFs of all these covers. It was amazing. It was it took a long time. It was very difficult, but they actually sent me these, and they perfectly illustrate. And it's very interesting to show these in other countries because people don't believe that these are actual covers of public, newspapers that would go into the stands. So again, it was so touching down at this other point, this moment of total delirium, the eve of the invasion. Some examples. And then the kind of the aftermath, which is the 2007 embassy, the largest and most expensive embassy ever built. So this is so we went from this, these are bookends. We have the Sirte embassy, sending the architect out to kind of to hang out in in Baghdad and research, and then we have this, which is the mega bunker, Fortress America. And on this, I think maybe I have a slide of just an aerial view. There's the new compound. Yeah, there you can. So I think this is, you can compare the two compounds here. So the upper right is the 1960 embassy, and then the lower is the 2007 embassy. So it's kind of where did we go wrong? And then here is a very recent photo of the 1960 embassy I just found. I just discovered actually that the government of Barcelona was trying to buy this building and make it an Instituto Cervantes, and the crisis hit, and they abandoned the project. But it was an interesting connect. It was considered like such an important piece of architecture that there was a project to do that. And that's it. Oops.
Wow.
Oops, sorry.
Bulbs fizzing out. So, I mean, it's 7:25. Well,
Yeah.
how should we use the rest of this time? I'm worried about audience wanting to participate, or whether you want to.
So I
Reciprocate.
just one more. I want to hear a couple more comments from you about this, your ideas about artists and this retrospective gaze, and why. What are your conclusions on why? What's wrong with us? Like, why are we doing this? Why are we going back?
What's wrong with you? Okay, Dr. Claire will give you her
Dr.
diagnosis.
Claire, on the mic.
It's, it's a very scrambled research project at the moment, and I'm just sort of proceeding intuitively out of a number of things, which are overlapping, and this is partly why it makes it very difficult to write about. So one is the question of research-based art, and questions of spectatorship and how we behave and how we consume this kind of information and the relationship that has to our digital environment. The other one is a sort of more along the lines of artistic strategies. And at the moment I'm calling it repurposing. Yeah? So taking a pre-existing cultural artifact and translating it across into another medium to do something different with it. And so this would be something that marks it as different from, say, appropriation art in the 80s, which was primarily photographs of photographs and dealing with the long tail of ramifications of the Benjamin essay, the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, which was not translated into English until relatively late, and which also differ from previous modalities like the ready-made. And there seem to be some things that are very distinctive about the way in which contemporary artists refer to or quote pre-existing cultural artifacts. And one of those things is this sort of translation across mediums. So a building becomes a film,
Right.
or a novel becomes a photo book becomes a piece of choreography, or radio broadcasts become poems. Or that there's that mobility between medium. But another one is a sort of an attachment to the proper name, more than ever before. So the name of the architect carries an aura and a resonance in a way that becomes a crucial part of the work. This field of connotation as a brand,
Yeah.
basically. So it could be, it's Johnson, or it's Barragan, or it's Mies, or it's especially Corbusier and Niemeyer are the two biggest, scoring hits of works of art about these projects by these architects.
I think that's partly brand association.
Yeah.
You can go to it from a marketing perspective as well.
Yeah.
I want to add something, because I think another aspect to this is continuing along with this idea of appropriation. I think I see this evolution from Duchamp to the picture generation, et cetera, and to my generation, which I think the objet trouvé has become an entire practice, has become like the art historian, like the practice of coming from other fields. Maybe you're bringing in the practice of the architect, or you're actually appropriating entire
Or
practices.
the archivist, or even the curator, because
Absolutely.
you're
Yeah.
assembling
For
a
sure.
lot of materials and trying to produce some kind of narrative out of that, but visually rather than verbally.
So I see that as a kind of continuation of the
Yeah.
of the appropriation drive of the objet trouvé. that's
But you
done.
can see there's also an important difference, because it's no longer about questions of authorship and originality, which was the discourse surrounding that work in the 80s.
Right. That's true.
We've decided those ideas are a little, they're boring, they're over. These are sort of resolved issues for us now. In a cut and paste culture, this information is circulating very freely. So I think questions of authorship and originality are no longer on the table. Instead, it is about something about, the branding, the kind of the power of the field of connotations of the proper name of the architect or artist in question, who is being quoted and repurposed in this way. And then the other thing that I've got sort of nagging in my mind about this stuff is the way in which there is such an attachment to and fascination for utopian thinking of the 20th century. And the fact that this arises as a subject matter for art in a retrospective mode only after the end of the Cold War and the collapse of communism, at least in the West. So, and I want to think more about what has triggered these kind of practices in other parts of the world. And I think the Latin American situation is interesting in the light of the introduction you gave about what kind of place Mexico City was when you arrived in 93.
Yeah.
By Zapatistas, the earthquake, the Salinas presidency, and the sort of the beginning of NAFTA and neoliberalism. So I wondered if you could maybe take some distance towards the Latin Americans, or let's say the Mexican situation, because each of these countries has their own specific cultural and political context. But what is if we say in Europe there is a sudden efflorescence of work in the mid-1990s that looks back at the Soviet era, at the fall of the wall, and at the end of communism as any kind of political alternative, be it good or bad. That there is a sense that is now over, that's now in the past, and the work of art looks back at this period, and you can see a transition in mood from the 90s, which is more
definitely.
ambivalent, through to the last decade, which is much more nostalgic and romanticizing of that mid-century utopianism. So what's going on in Mexico that leads to artists like Pedro Reyes and yourself producing work that looks back at 50s and 60s modernism? Because it seems to me that that's always the focus rather than earlier work. It's not that international style period
Yeah,
of the
I think
20s.
I think it's part of a global trend, and I think it's a generational thing. I think a lot of us were born in this period, in the maybe 20, 30 years after the war. We still had the example of the Soviet Union, of course, denigrated by Stalin or whatever, but there was that alternative was still there. Built originally as some kind of utopia. And as I mentioned in the new Utopias piece, I saw 1980 as kind of like the end point. I've always also in the U.S. Again, I'm coming back to the U.S. I've always thought of the post-war period as a kind of New Deal hangover a little bit within the public sector. There are a lot of ideas. There's a kind of ideological strain that kind of, as much as we had McCarthyism and these things, there was still enormous kind of public spiritedness. We had public housing programs, schools, et cetera, kind of happening at the same time. So I see that as a kind of a little bit of an ideological hangover from the pre-war period, and that absolutely came to an end in 1980. And so the 70s, in that piece in particular, were the kind of the last hurrah of that moment. And it was a kind of a utopian moment. It was like we're looking for progressive models, and that kind of stopped. So it's a good question. In that generation in Mexico, I think
Is it an implicit critique of this, this second modernity of Salinas neoliberalism?
I would say, it's a good point, because in that sense you could say there's a kind of nostalgic engine under the project. When definitely for what I've just said indicates that we're in this kind of bleak, conservative future, and we have a nostalgia for the 60s and 70s and going back further.
I just wonder if we could turn the conversation back to the issue of informational art, which really interested me. I wonder if there isn't a sense that we misread that kind of art by thinking of it as propositional and discursive because it's made up of bits of propositions and discursive material. That is because it's made of texts that claim things. I remember seeing your piece at the Hirshhorn and thinking that it was actually much closer to certain traditional forms of representation. I was thinking of landscape and still life, an interest in the surfeit of information that you get in your standard traditional old master, certain kinds of old master images, or even in Cézanne, for instance. When Claire seemed frustrated that there was too much information and that you didn't know where to look or what to look at, those are just the critiques that people had of Cézanne and even before that of Impressionism. And I remember thinking in the Hirschhorn that there was something very much, very traditional in that interest in just pointing at the world, an ostension, a kind of extreme ostension, saying, here's the world, I'm not going to filter it for you completely. And just as every traditional picture has cropping in it, has an edge, chooses things to point at, it also has a surfeit within it. And it seemed to me that that's one way of looking at informational art in general, and not imagining that in some ways it ought to be filtering that information, but that it's a more straightforwardly representational act in a traditional sense. Does that make sense to you, Terence? It's also a kind of defense, I think, of Terence's work.
No, I think that's very interesting. I hadn't thought of that across, but it does. Maybe it links to something I was thinking about earlier, which is a lot of old master paintings are depicting religious scenes which are predicated on knowledge of the Bible or other supporting religious texts. Do you think your work is the viewer gets more out of your work if they're familiar with modernist architecture?
I don't know. I think there are many portals. There are these kind of super elemental formal. The work is designed with many points of access. I pointed out 3 in the Hirschhorn installation. One could be this. You can go in and do your little research if you want.
But the quotations are all predicated on you getting them as quotations, yeah? That this is the architect, the seats from the glass house. In your,
I don't know. I think
these are little things that we're supposed to read, and it requires a certain education to be able to read them. And certainly, like when I was, 10 years ago, I couldn't read this stuff at all.
Yeah.
And I had friends who were very much into modernist furniture because that was the cool way to furnish a flat. It was absolutely illegible to me. I thought it just looked like ugly office furniture. And I had to go through a sort of, a re-education of my eyes. And so I realized there's a whole there's a sort of a class aspirational component to the fascination with modernist design and architecture, which is
like kind of.
Yeah, it's an in vocabulary, and when you think about when that tide started to turn, it's also mid-1990s with the beginning of Wallpaper magazine, and with 96, I think, with the growth of an aspirational young affluent class who want to furnish their lofts with this kind of with Saarinen and Alto and
those
it's I don't know. So I'm just a little troubled by how the aesthetic of this work feeds so easily into the aesthetic of not just a sort of a younger, cool hipster
so
class,
cultural
but also
elitism, right?
a cultural elitism, but also in that it fits so perfectly in collectors' homes. And the Amy Siegel video that you pointed me to in September, that was on show at some gallery in the Lower East Side, called Provenance, deals with the fate of Corbusier and Jeanneret chairs from Chandigarh in India, where they're used in the university library, and how they then are refurbished and put on sale in the architecture market, and finally they end up in collectors' homes. Except the twist of her video is that she tells the story backwards. So it opens with these sumptuous shots of major collectors' homes with these chairs sitting very nicely in them, and it rewinds backwards to the university library where students are still sitting on these chairs now doing their research. And although the video clearly, on the surface level is a critique of the fate of those objects and their migration from India to, the international collecting class, to the homes of the 1%, to the luxury yachts of the 1%. At the same time, the way in which the video is filmed is so pristine and cool and beautiful that it fits perfectly within the domestic interiors of the collecting class. And that left me feeling kind of uneasy. And I do get that with a lot of art about modernist architecture and design, is that we're back in the world of the elite.
I feel like there's no, and this is again the way I design my, there's no single route through the work. There's no single narrative that you follow as you experience the work. It can be a super glancing, it can be just an emotional response to this video or whatever. Most people at the Hirshhorn did kind of just walk in and walked out with a sense of horror or delight. And the other references that are built into the work, it's a kind of enriching process. I think I'm putting myself into the work. So so if somebody gets that, that's fine, that's great. Is it essential to really entering the work? No, I don't think so at all. I think getting that Philip Johnson reference at the end in the elitism is a kind of personal message kind of hidden in the work that if you, everything's designed to kind of spend time with. Maybe in 2 or 3 years you do an architecture degree and you realize that. But I feel like the work is accessible on a million different levels, and I don't think the research is essential. I don't think this discourse is essential to an interpretation and access to the work. I've never felt that. I think I feel like a baby can have a
I'm
pretty
curious to know
complete experience of the work.
what the students here think.
He's talking about Amy's piece.
Okay.
For the Provenance film,
Yeah.
the whole part when they actually discard the chairs in the offices, I think is actually quite interesting
Really poignant.
in terms of practicality and anything we might think today of it. So I just wanted to point that out.
I was going to state to the gentleman in front who was talking about Cézanne, and how I guess in a way they were pointing at something, but what they were pointing at was what the industrial bourgeois of the time, the French bourgeois, wanted to see. I mean, it was the culture that they wanted to have in their households. It was of the bistro, of the cafe, of the apartment, the ballet, the dancers, and in a way, that aesthetic autonomy kind of moves on to kind of this, modern architecture, kind of in the same sense. It's a hip kind of thing for people to collect. It's what they want to see. It's what they want, and as a way, we fill that desire for them, as artists, kind of. It's either the aesthetic autonomous, artist, or it's the anti-aesthetic. And
except that modern architecture is our habitat as human beings. I mean, we live, it's like.
But that's only because that is what is stated by the sphere that kind of enacts culture for us in this kind of realm. You know what I mean?
It goes deeper than hipness, though, or.
It's not just hipness. No, it's coming from the top, and it's coming and it's influencing culture. I mean, when we talk about how desire is flat, we don't, same thing with Marxism. Marxism had it right in terms of everybody should want the same things, except it's not, a farm and just enough. It's the same things that the rich have. It's Chanel, it's, Yves Saint Laurent, it's buying stuff from Whole Foods, it's all that stuff.
Aspirational.
It's aspirational, and we all have that desire, and that's built into us as human beings in this type of culture that we live in.
That's what Artigas was playing into with designing these houses for wealthy people in Mexico. I mean, modernism is aspirational was very interesting, that moment.
I want to hear
I-
more from the audience.
I want to actually. I just want to mention very quickly to Blake's comment about the text, because we're I feel like the use of a lot of text in the installations goes back to when I was like right after art school. I was doing this like collaborations with lawyers, and I do have walls of legalese and things like this. And I was looking a lot at conceptual art and the kind of the daunting aspect of text in art, and it was an experiment with kind of pushing that to the extreme. So I think text became this kind of object in a way in the work, and maybe that's what you were seeing. And I think it's always, for me, I've always, as much as it is a portal, a body of information, it is also an object that I work with. Yeah.
I just had more of a comment, or like maybe just a thing to share with you that you might find interesting in relation to the piece about the 26th Street housing projects. One of the sort of early designs on the drawing board of the original Twin Tower complex of the World Trade Center was because there was a charter to have a specific amount of space on the 16-acre site. And so one of the original or early ideas was to have these mid-rise or low-rise complexes throughout the site, just spread across the 16 acres.
For housing?
No, for business.
Okay.
And then ultimately they decided that would look bad because it would be too resembling of all of New York City's housing projects, which is partly how the buildings got to be so tall, was that they just decided to stack them all up into 1,300 foot.
That's another example of kind of going back to the the original meaning of the form of the building. And I think I also was looking at the why are New York housing projects brick, raw brick, and it was a reference to Ebenezer Howard's Garden Cities. It was like a really direct reference to this kind of ideal green city, prefabricated, or newly built green city. But sorry, go on.
I just wanted to share that with you.
See, that's what those complexes represented to those
Sure.
people already at that point. I guess it's late 70s. Yeah.
And it kind of relates to Claire Bishop's point, that perhaps we can see
So deployment of modernism.
the cleanliness, the depopulation,
Yeah.
the way that it works as a metonymy, is a way of rationalizing the information, is it a way of organizing it, in the way that modernism was used or seen as at that time period.
By information, do you mean the research that Terence does about the various projects? Or do you
We've been
mean
talking
information
about
in a
Terence's projects as kind of information.
info heavy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that they're text-based, that they are engagements, and that there could be another way of looking at them in a formalist way, and we thought about doing a formal analysis of them, like looking at them like Cezanne. But I wanted to kind of come back to the point of, why are we invoking modernism when we're dealing with this kind of informational artwork?
Can very quickly just trigger this idea. When I was doing the Hirschhorn installation, I was thinking of the arrangement of the elements in the room, because we had actual kind of reproductions of buildings, but we also had the 4 vitrines, and I was thinking of a kind of urbanism. I mean, it's a kind of tangent to what you're thinking, but and a modern urbanism in the arrangement of the installation. Definitely thinking about that, but I don't think that's exactly what you're.
No, I think it's a nice point, though. It's a way of, so modernism is not a subject matter here so much as a strategy or a device or a means of organizing the information.
Aesthetic or
Yeah.
an organizational.
So like an
device?
organizational method.
Mm-hmm.
Since I have the microphone, I could chime in that, would you think that modern architecture is a kind of informationalized architecture more so than prior forms of architecture, in the sense that embedded in the form are certain anthropocentric ideas, and so when looking at information, say vis-a-vis the pictures generation, so there's a whole other body of work that's about text-based information, I think, which your work speaks to or works within, and and that, so having that work discuss pre-informational era architecture or early informational architecture is of course like the perfect subject matter to discuss information. And then
I think more than information, I'd say representational, going back to that idea. I think one of my interests, and again, it's this kind of entropy thing that I'm interested in, is what did we have before the modern movement? We had the Beaux-Arts movement, which was all over, where everything you did was symbolic, like everything, this particular line of columns represented a bank, or you did this and it was a school kind of thing. There was a kind of a system of a symbolic system that was employed all through that. And the idea was that in the modern movement was that we're going to break with that. We're working with an entirely functional, non-symbolic vocabulary now. And what I'm very interested in how that quickly became symbolic and that started to represent. I think a lot of this work is really about that happening. I see that a little bit as a breakdown of the original ideas. So I don't know. But information,
I don't know. I mean, what you say makes me think in a slightly different direction, but it's about an availability of archives in relationship to this work compared to previous moments in architecture, which I can't speak to at all, but it seems telling that two of the pieces you described came from invitations from institutions to go through their archives and produce work in response to that. Yeah, so there's something about, an institutional... The institution wants, I don't think it wants a critique, but there's something, there's something a little therapeutic or narcissistic about inviting artists to come in and work with their archives and produce a work about it. Does that worry you?
There aren't that many that do it. I mean, there's the Smithsonian, this was unusual. The Hirschhorn invited me, and then the Smithsonian immediately said, we're going to do this artist research thing, which was kind of radical. I've never, there are very few places around the world doing it. And
I feel that you get that in Europe a lot.
In
Come
Europe
and
it's a
look
lot
at
more,
our
yeah.
archives. Come and make a work about it.
Yeah, or readings of collections is very common. I've done a lot of them, but it's not. Is it a kind of therapeutic? It's kind of like open, a transparency type thing. Is in the aftermath of institutional critique. It's a really
I think
good
it's
question.
narcissism.
I think it's just narcissism, institutional narcissism.
Who doesn't want a work of art about themselves?
Yeah. And the Hirschhorn got one.
Yeah,
it's true.
You delivered.
well, that's still private information, generally speaking.
Yeah.
Like it's not like widely available on the internet yet. I'll pass this over, but I mean, we're living in the post-information era at the moment, so it's
A post-information era.
according to certain sociologists,
Right.
but because the information is already relationalized, it's through social media, it's all locally specific. So the
writes
idea of the
about that?
archive, I'd have to check some notes, but I'll email it to you.
Okay.
You email me. Yeah.
Not sure if this is a question or just a comment, but throughout I was thinking about the direct relationship of all these megalomaniac builders in to a particular ideology. I mean, when you drive through Germany, you can see all these remnants of Hitler's architecture. If you think of Heidelberg and so on, even Kassel, these are things that were built by commissioned and very important architects. Same as in Italy with Mussolini, and so throughout Latin America, everywhere, in the United States, Philip Johnson. That's kind of the case. So I was thinking about.
Yeah, there's a kind of social realist architecture around the world. It was kind of like.
And the irony of then these objects, furniture and whatnot, all the decoration, all the spin-offs or spill-offs from this particular style or movement or taste, then turning up again in these super collections, and also the monuments associated with this kind of art, the sculptures and the this and the that and the busts and the memorializing, all of that. I mean, it's pretty pathetic if you start thinking about that as being material for contemporary art and the purchases of it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, it's just worrying.
Another question right behind Carlo.
Oh, thank you. Okay, I'm just having some random thoughts here.
Good.
The first thing is that about all the information, I love seeing information in
All right.
vitrines, and then usually I can't read it because it's really tiny, and I keep being told not to lean on the vitrines. But Claire, that you said about the narcissism of inviting people to the archives, I also have a feeling that people are very scared that no one's interested in their archives anymore, and everything is just going to be uploaded, and so the photographs with the stamps on the back will never be seen or something. So I think maybe they find that artists are more willing to go in there and dig as opposed to someone
for sure. And an artist will
writing.
usually produce a more free-flowing, unusual narrative than if an institutional archivist had gone in and decided to tell the story of how the Hirshhorn had been founded. Yeah? So there's something very characteristic, and which you'll have noticed in the way in which Terence presents his projects as well, particularly with the Baghdad one, that it sort of flows from one thing to the next thing to the next thing in a way that would be very unsatisfying as an essay or as a written argument, which some people were pointing at. But an artist can get away with it because it's more evocative, it's more image-based. It's under no obligation to tie up the ends in a way that
We have artistic license.
Yeah.
you have license, exactly. So yeah, for sure there are many reasons. I'm being just cynical and skeptical.
And the other idea is about sort of all utopian thinking being simple. So in this case, it's the clean lines and depopulation and everything. But I sometimes think that there's sort of someone designs a chair that's very clean and beautiful, and then by the time it arrives to being used, it's made out of plastic in some factory.
And believe me, there are many works of art about that. The number of
and
things that are
it's sort of
mashups between modernism and IKEA.
And
I mean,
IKEA,
you
can do a whole show on. But I don't necessarily think, going back to the young men here, that the other side would be any more enlightening in a funny kind of way.
The other side being?
The other side of the question. So if all these things were populated, and because the history does exist of what was destroyed to build Lincoln Center or to, I mean, that exists too. But it's still interesting to trace the line that Terence is doing. One doesn't negate the other, I feel.
I should also, when I talk about like progressive, progressive model, you have to always kind of divorce that from like technological modernism or the technological progress, which I think is that kind of diverged from social progress at a point where each kind of gave the other a bad name. So I'm looking at those things very separately as well. So, I mean, Lincoln Center is a good example of that divergence. Is that it?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you, guys.
And your questions.